Hi everybody and welcome to a new video in the deep learning audio application from design to deployment series. This time we'll be deploying our speech recognition system with Docker. So we're gonna get to the really cool stuff here. But before getting started, let's get a refresher where we are at with the last video. Okay, so this is the architecture that we've built so far. So we have a client that can send a post request with an audio file. UWSGI is acting as our HTTP server and it's firing Flask, which fires TensorFlow. We get a prediction on a keyword that gets rolled back all the way back to the client. Good. So last time we said that a UWSGI is a very capable application server, but in production environment, we want to use a good HTTP server like NGINX. And so this is what we are going to be doing today as the first step. So we'll be adding NGINX in front of UWSGI. And now the point there is that apart from adding NGINX, we want also to deploy our application, machine learning application using Docker containers. The reason why we do that is because containers are great because they can be served and deployed on any platforms regardless of the hardware, and they are just really good to avoid any potential configuration issues. So what we'll build today is a Docker network that looks a little bit like this. So we'll have two containers, one for NGINX and another one for Flask. And this one is also going to contain UWSGI. And then, as I said, everything is going to be orchestrated by Docker Compose, which is going to set up the network and ensure that the containers can talk to each other. So the information flow here is quite straightforward. First, we just fire an HTTP post request with an audio file with some keyword. Then NGINX picks up that request and it proxies the information to UWSGI using a TCP socket that uses the UWSGI, all small caps, protocol. And then UWSGI again fires Flask. Flask calls TensorFlow, we get a prediction, and then we just backpropagate the keyword that's been predicted all the way to the client. Good. Okay, so the first step here, obviously, that you guys should do is install both Docker and Docker Compose. Now, to do that, you can go to the Docker website, and so here you have a page that gives you information on how to install Docker for Mac, Windows, or Linux. And here you have another page for installing Docker Compose. I'm not going to install Docker and Docker Compose because I've already installed them before. So, but I'll link the I'll just put the links to this installation pages in the description below. Good. Okay, so let's get started with the real stuff here then. Okay, so here, guys, you should see all the stuff that we've built so far in the previous videos. Now, just don't bother that I have a 7 high level folder here, because this is just the number of videos we are currently in, which is video number 7 in the series. But the interesting stuff, it's all that happens inside this folder. Good. Now, the first thing that we should do is a huge work in terms of restructuring, refactoring our code base. And so we'll get started by creating a new folder here. Let's call it in the at root level. So here we'll create a folder, and we'll call this folder classifier. Right. Okay, so for the classifier, we want just to put into that bucket everything that has to do with training, processing, of the data set and the data itself, so that we don't put that into the Docker container because like we don't need that. Okay, so what we want to do here basically is to get data.json, prepare dataset, and train.py, and we're going to move them into like this classifier folder. Okay, this is good. Okay, so I'm just going to close this file. Okay, so then we need another couple of folders here. So one is going to be called Flask, and it's going to contain everything that has to do with our Flask application or Flask deployment of our speech recognition system. And then we're going to have a separate folder where we'll basically have like our NGINX. And these two folders are going to be contain all the instruction for building the two Docker containers. So NGINX and Flask. Okay, so let's create the Flask directory first. And so here I'm going to move all the stuff that we need for running the Flask application. So the configuration file app.ini, the keyword spotting service, which basically has our machine learning model, the model itself, and server.py. So yeah, let's move that into Flask. Okay, that's good. Again, let me just like close all of these files. We don't need them. And finally, I'm going to create a directory called NGINX. Okay, this is great. So now this client.py is going to remain at root level because we really don't need to package that into like the two Docker containers, because we're going to be running like client.py on our local machine basically, and then hit the server or like the Docker network in this case. Good. Okay, so now the next thing that we want to do is to create Docker files. So first of all, we'll create a Docker file here in Flask. So we'll call this Docker file, and in the Docker files, basically we package all the information, all the instructions that we want to provide to Docker in order to create a container. So we need one for Flask, and then we need one for NGINX. So I'm just going to put that one in. So Docker file. Okay. And we'll be starting from Flask first. I'm going to be cheating a little bit today because I'm not going to type in all the instructions here in the Docker file. Rather, I'm just going to copy paste them from Gedit here. I've already like implemented this, and given like these are quite mnemonic, there's no need to just like type them out. Good. Okay, so here we have all the instructions. So we'll be like analyzing them like one by one. Okay, so we'll start from the first one, which is like basically like it's a from command, which pulls an image from Docker Hub. And the image that we're pulling is that of like TensorFlow with Python 3. So now you can pull all the images that you want from Docker Hub, which is like this platform that has like thousands of Docker images already like packaged up, and you can just like pull them. And if you are wondering about what is a Docker image, well, Docker image is a file that contains all the instructions that you need to create a Docker container. So you have Docker images for TensorFlow, for NGINX, as we'll see in a second, or for Ubuntu, whatever, like really. Okay, so here basically we're just like pulling from Docker Hub the TensorFlow Docker image. Then with this work there like instruction, we are setting the working directory to /app. That's going to be like a new directory that's placed at root level in the container. Then we are going to be transferring like all the files from the current directory, so all of these files basically, into the app directory in the container. Then we'll be installing a bunch of like audio libraries here that will be needing for running Librosa for like input output. mainly like operations with audio. So as you see here, we have this run command, and run can be used to run like command line commands in a container while we're building the container. Then once we've done that, we need to install all the Python dependencies. And so we'll do a run, and then we'll just like do a normal pip install -r requirements.txt. Now you may be wondering, but Valeria, we don't have requirements.txt. Yes, that's correct. So we need to like create that. So I'll fire up the terminal. So yeah, let me just remove that. Okay, so I'm already like in the Flask folder. So what I want to do here is a pip freeze, and then the result of the freeze, which is basically a list of all the dependencies, Python dependencies, I'm going to channel to requirements.txt. Good. Okay, so let's see if we have that. Okay, so here we have it. So, and as you can see here, for example, I have like a Flask. Down here, you'll see that we need like also like this, the version 2.1.0 of TensorFlow, which is great. Okay, so now let's go back to the Flask Docker file. Okay, so once we have all of this, then the final thing that we'll do is running this cmd or command, and we'll pass in a couple of parameters. Basically what this does, it starts the uWSGI server, and here like the two parameters that we are passing is uWSGI and app.ini. And if you guys remember from my previous video, app.ini is the config file that has like all the configurations that we need for uWSGI. Good. Okay, so this is basically equivalent to running something like this, and we did this like last time. So uWSGI, and then you would do app.ini. So if you're wondering about the difference between a run and command, well, a run gets run only like once while we're building a container, whereas like command gets run when the container has already been built and we are starting the container. Okay, this is cool. So one other thing that we need to do here, like in Flask, I mean, like we are basically ready to go with this, the Flask Docker container, but a nice thing to add here is a file that's called a docker ignore. So, and here, in this file, we put all the files and folders that we don't want to transfer to the Docker container. This is a little bit similar to a git ignore file, where you put like all this stuff like a virtual environments, like cache and things like that, that you don't want to transfer to GitHub. Okay, so here what I don't want to put in the transfer into the container is PyCache. Okay. That's good. Okay, so we should be good to go with Flask here. So now we can move on and work with NGINX. Okay, so let's focus on the Docker file for NGINX. Again, I'm not going to type in like all of this information, but rather I'm going to, oops, let me just close this. I'm just gonna copy paste it. Okay, so here we want to build this NGINX container. So what we'll do, we'll just like pull an NGINX image from Docker Hub, and we'll do that by running from NGINX. And then another thing that we want to do here is remove the default NGINX config file and replace that with a new config file that's going to have like all the information, all the settings that we want NGINX to have for our application. So which basically means that we need to build that file, right? So we'll create a new file which we'll call nginx.conf. Okay. So once again, I have this file like here. just gonna copy paste that. Right. Okay. So now let's try to understand what's happening here. So it's worth saying that like this config file can get like very complex when we are dealing like with NGINX, but here I'm going to be using like a very simple version of it, just like the minimal functionalities. Okay, so the first thing that I want to mention is that the server, so NGINX, is going to listen on this port, so 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is like the port where NGINX is listening, and then we are passing in a couple of parameters that have to do with the size of the audio files, or like the requests that are incoming from the client. So this client body buffer size specifies the maximum amount of data that we can store like in buffer, and then the client max body size specifies the maximum amount, the maximum size of the files that NGINX is going to read. So we'll set this up to 5 megabytes. So if it's more than that, NGINX is going to fire an error. Good. So here is like the kind of like more interesting part. So first of all, we want to include the UWSGI params. So this is a file that contains like all the stuff like regarding the UWSGI protocol. And then this is the crucial part. So this UWSGI pass, right? Okay, so what's UWSGI pass? So this is like the kind of like the place where we want to proxy the incoming information towards, right? And so we want to proxy this information to Flask. That's going to be the name of the Docker container in the Flask container inside the Docker network, and then we're going to channel this to port 900. Now, there's one thing that we need to change in the UWSGI configurations here. So if you guys remember, like in the previous video, we set up this config file app.ini, setting up this HTTP equal to port 5050. Now we want to change this. So we don't want for UWSGI to act as an HTTP server anymore. So we want to change this to socket. So this is going to be a TCP socket, and we'll have this socket listening on port 900. And this socket is going to be using the UWSGI, all small caps, protocol. So now let's go back to the NGINX config file. So when we say with this UWSGI pass that we want to proxy the incoming information to Flask at port 900, we're basically proxying all the incoming like requests from the client to the Flask container and on port 900 where we have UWSGI that's actively listening. Good. Okay, so now this Flask name, we're going to need to like set it up in the config file for the Docker Compose like setting. Good. Okay, so I believe that this is like all we need to do for NGINX. So now we have like all the instructions for building like our Docker containers both for Flask and NGINX. So now there's one little thing missing, which is adding a file that's called docker compose.yml. So this file, we're gonna like set it here in the at root level. And so here in this file, we need to pass in all the instructions for like creating the different like Docker containers and the services. And basically like with this file, we are orchestrating the Docker network and we are creating the connections between like all of these containers. So once again, I'll be getting back like to this Gedit file and I'll be copy pasting it in here. Good. So in the Docker Composer, the first thing that we want to set up is the version, and we're going to be using version 3.7. And then we'll be setting up the services. So here we have a network with 2 services. So one is Flask and the other one is NGINX. So let's start from Flask. So the first thing that we'll do is a build, and we'll pass this relative path. Basically what this means is that when Docker is building the container, we'll be looking into this relative path here. So it will look into this Flask folder, and it will search for the Docker file, and then it will just run that to build the container. And here we pass the container name, and the container name is Flask. And as you guys can see, here in the config file for NGINX, this is the same name that we've passed here, in the uWSGI path, right? So this is the host name for the Flask container. Good. Okay. Then we just set up restart to always, which basically means that the Flask container is always going to restart. And then this is a crucial one. We want to expose a port. So exposing is not opening a port to the outside world. Rather, it is exposing a port, opening a port inside the Docker network. So basically here we're saying that the Flask application has to open port 900 to the Docker network, and I've chosen port 900 here because this is the port that we used here. This is the port at which uWSGI is listening on. Good. Okay, so this is all good for Flask. Now let's take a look at NGINX. So again, we want to build this container, and we are just saying Docker to look into this relative path here. So we are saying, hey Docker, go check out the NGINX folder, and it'll autonomously identify the Docker file if there is one and run it so that it has all the information to build the container. And then we'll pass in the container name. That's going to be NGINX. So we'll just specify once again restart always, and here we have another crucial piece of information, that's ports. Now this parameter does something very interesting. So basically it opens ports to the external world, and it maps all the incoming request from certain ports on the host machine onto the container. So basically here, this 80:1234, it's basically a way of mapping the a port on the host machine. That could be your server, and in our case is going to be in the next video our AWS EC2 instance, and it maps that port on the host machine onto the container. So basically here we're saying every time we have an incoming a request on port 80 of the host machine, please map that onto port 1234 of the NGINX container. And we are choosing 1234 here because we know that NGINX is listening on port 1234 just because we set that up in our config file. Good. Okay, so let me just remove this, otherwise I'm going to get an error. And yeah, I think we have everything ready to build this container network. To create the Docker containers, we can fire up the terminal and then use this command. So docker compose, and then we'll use build. Okay, so I'm going to run this, and as you can see, it supposedly built the 2 Docker containers. The reality here is that I've already built this, so it took just a second just to recompile that. But in reality, if you're running this for the first time, it's going to take probably a few minutes. Okay, so now the final thing that we want to do is just start these the Docker containers, and for doing that we can do docker compose and then run the app command here. Okay, so as you can see, it's starting like both NGINX and Flask, the two containers, and here we should have our like Docker network like running. So now the final thing that remains to do is just like to hit this network and just like get back a prediction and see like if like everything works like as it's supposed to do. Okay, so for that we should go to this like client.py, and we have just like to do a little change here. So if you guys remember, like in the previous video, UWSGI was listening on port 5050, but now like we are just like listening on port like 80. So I'm just gonna remove that the port 5050 from the URL, and the rest should all remain unchanged, and hopefully it should work. So okay, so here we have our Docker containers like running, and here I want to fire up another terminal, and so I'm just gonna get into here, and then I want to activate the virtual environment. So I'll do this, and then I'm gonna cd into 7, and I'll do a Python client.py. So basically I'm just running the client, and let's see if we have like any response here from the server or the Docker container. Okay, so here we go, and yeah, that's great. So we just got back a response with the predicted keyword is left. So this is great because now like the Docker containers are working like as they're supposed to. So when we run the post request from the client along with like an audio file, that's picked up by the Docker containers, NGINX first, that proxies the information to UWSGI, that fires up Flask, that fires up TensorFlow. We get a prediction that's rolled back to our client. So let me just like rerun this, and here we go. So here we have like also the information about the post request. Okay, so this is great. This is like all working. So slowly but surely we are getting there. So we're almost at the point where we can finish like deploying our application with Docker, with UWSGI, with NGINX. And the last thing that really remains to do is only to put this Docker application onto an AWS EC2 instance. And this is like the topic of next video, which is going to be the last for this series. Good. So I hope you've enjoyed like this video. Hope you've learned quite a lot about Docker container, and how we can like deploy stuff with that along with like NGINX. If that's the case and you've enjoyed the video, please like, and remember to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll get like more videos like this. And I guess it's all for today. Cheers.